Welcome to the 5th episode of the 8-part podcast Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature, a series about awkward letters, daring books and angry text. Today, Remorse of a Terrorist. Your host is Otto Boele, senior lecturer at Leiden University, specialized in Russian literature and film history. Otto, after several episodes about chastity and unbridled sex, you decided it's time for something different, more explosive.
Literally, yes, because there's indeed something explosive about the book and the writer of this episode. The Pale Horse is about a terrorist attack, and the writer, Boris Savinkov, was no stranger to the terrorist environment.
Is it some form of confessional literature? I mean, a terrorist who suddenly feels the urge to write?
Well, The Pale Horse is certainly an inside story of a terrorist with quite a track record. And you can assume that he wrestled with a moral dilemma and tried to cope with it by writing this novel. But there's more to it than that. He had the necessary connections, not only among the revolutionary movement, but also among writers and poets. And this is what makes him such a fascinating figure. In 1909, Russia's literary world was taken aback by The Pale Horse, a modest novel in the form of a diary in which the main character describes how he is involved in the preparation and execution of a terrorist attack. It's a logistically very complicated operation that eventually succeeds. The target, a high official in Moscow, is killed with a bomb. The name of the author, V. Ropshin, was completely unknown to the critics. But a suspicion quickly arose that it was a pseudonym, behind which someone was hiding who was no stranger among terrorist groups. Contrary to what was usual in left radical literature of the time, the main character was not portrayed as an idealistic hero, but rather as a cynic whose actions only seemed to discredit the revolutionary cause. When the true identity of the author was revealed, all hell broke loose. The author turned out to be none other than Boris Savinkov, the mastermind behind the notorious assassination of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich in 1905, a full uncle of the Tsar. For the terrorist organization to which Savinkov belonged, this was a resounding victory, and the novel, The Pale Horse, provided a fictionalized account of it, written by one of the regime's most dangerous enemies. We have now learned two new names: Savinkov, the terrorist, and Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, his victim. Now let's give the floor to someone we only know too well.
4 февраля 1905 года бомбой брошенной террористом был убит великий князь Sergei Alexandrovich.
It's May 4th, 2017. The man speaking is of course Vladimir Putin, and he's about to unveil a cross-shaped monument on Senate Square in the Kremlin. The monument to be unveiled is not the original one, but a replica. The Bolsheviks had the original monument removed quite soon after they had seized power. That's hardly surprising, as it was intended to honor the memory of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, who was killed on this very spot in February 1905. So to recap, the Tsar had the monument erected in 1906. The Bolsheviks took it down in 1918. And Putin is putting it back in 2017 because, as he says, it will make people realize the enormous price Russia has paid for the mutual hatred and discord at the beginning of the 20th century. The monument will remind Russians how important it is to preserve stability and national unity. This is Putin as we know him, of course. Protest, demonstrations, any expression of disagreement will only lead to bloodshed, and therefore the monument for the Grand Duke should be put back where it belongs, in the center of Russian power, in the Moscow Kremlin.
Драматических событий, смуты, гражданского противостояния, с которым столкнулась затем Россия.
It's telling that Putin in his speech refuses to give a face or a name to the perpetrators of the attack. He speaks of a terrorist who is supposed to have thrown a fatal bomb at the Grand Duke, but that creates the erroneous impression that the murderer was a lone wolf, nobody who acted out of desperation. But that was certainly not the case. The bomber's name was Ivan Kalyaev, undoubtedly one of Russia's most famous terrorists. His most important feat was the assassination of the Grand Duke. After throwing the bomb, Kalyaev was immediately arrested, sentenced to death and hanged. As a result, he has gone down in history as a martyr of the Russian Revolution. This is reflected in the fact that in Soviet times quite a few streets were named after him. Some cities even had a first Kalyaev Street, a second Kalyaev Street, a third Kalyaev Street. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, many revolutionary and socialist names were removed. The original pre-revolutionary names of cities and streets were restored. But this process has not yet been completed, and so Russia still has at least 15 cities with one or more Kalyaev streets. Putin's presentation of the historical facts in his speech is misleading for another reason. He talks about a terrorist, but the attack was the result of well-coordinated teamwork. That team consisted of 5 members, including Ivan Kalyaev, Dora Brilliant, the only female member and the explosive specialist, 2 backups who also carried a bomb should Kalyaev's first attempt fail, and at the head of that team was Boris Savinkov. Savinkov was under no circumstances to use violence himself. He was the coordinator and appointed to that position by the Central Committee of the Socialist-Revolutionaries, a left radical group to which I will return later. This is just to indicate that it was an extremely complicated operation that required weeks of preparation. The victim had to be stalked, his daily route mapped out. The members always had to take into account the possibility that the secret police were watching them, and therefore they regularly had to go into hiding, disappear from the city, or take on a different disguise.
Петербург забастовался, по всем заводам тишина.
How did Boris Savinkov become one of the most wanted opponents of the Tsarist regime? And how did his terrorist activities relate to his literary ambitions? Savinkov was born in 1879 in what is now the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. But he grew up in Warsaw, which then still belonged to the Russian Empire. Savinkov's father was a judge. With his mother, Sofia Savinkova, he would always have a very warm relationship. She too cherished literary ambitions. She wrote plays. But she also invested a lot of time and energy in her children, 3 sons and 3 daughters, whom she tried to instill a love for the arts, especially literature. Young Boris preferred the adventure novels of Sir Walter Scott and Mayne Reid, but he was also well versed in the Russian classics. Dostoevsky and Lermontov were among his favorite authors. Especially their tormented and wandering heroes must have captured his imagination, and we see that reflected in the novel The Pale Horse. Savinkov was a model student at Warsaw's First Boys' Gymnasium. He received high grades and followed the strict rules of conduct, but that didn't stop him from joining a socialist cell that was active at his school. His older brother, Alexander, was already a member, as well as Ivan Kalyaev, who soon became his friend. Savinkov's first clash with the authorities occurred shortly after he had moved to St. Petersburg to study law. During the winter vacation of 1897, he and his older brother, Alexander, were arrested. They were involved in a protest against government plans to erect a monument to Governor General Muravyov, the executioner of Vilnius. This Muravyov had been responsible for crushing the Polish uprising of 1863. Things didn't look good for the brothers, but thanks to their mother's lobbying, they were soon released. Their offense wasn't considered too serious after all. Savinkov's mother was relieved, of course, but she would later recall that this incident had only increased her son's determination. In her book, Years of Grief, Memories of a Mother, she wrote,
"I could see that they were unstoppable."
Just 2 months later, in early 1898, Boris' brother Alexander was arrested again, tried and sent to Yakutia, where he eventually would commit suicide. Studying law in St. Petersburg, Savinkov soon became active for a mutual aid society, which was generally known to be a hotbed for the radical student movement. To clear up a possible misunderstanding, Not all students were necessarily left-wing radicals. Some were politically inactive, others were more conservative or very conservative, and it was precisely this group of conservative students who were dissatisfied because this left-wing activism gave all students a bad name. So not everyone was a revolutionary, but a considerable part, especially the most vocal part, was radically left. And they also had a somewhat romanticized image of themselves. They considered themselves the politically most enlightened part of the student population, and therefore they saw themselves as the avant-garde of the revolution. Savinkov was immediately attracted to these radical circles and identified with their revolutionary ideas. Savinkov wasn't a very diligent and devoted student. He was involved in several illegal activities, ranging from student demonstrations to agitation and propaganda work. He married, barely 20 years old, Vera Uspienskaya, daughter of the well-known populist author Gleb Uspiensky, which must have given his revolutionary credentials an extra boost. At one point he was expelled from the University of St. Petersburg and then spent some time abroad, mainly in Paris and Berlin, cities with a large Russian diaspora. After his return to Russia, he was arrested along with dozens of other students. The Minister of Education, Nikolai Bogolyepov, had just been murdered, and the police were responding with a wave of arrests. Savinkov was imprisoned for several months in the infamous Peter and Paul fortress, and then sentenced to exile in the provincial town of Vologda, way up north. In Vologda, Savinkov spent just under a year. Then he managed to escape to Switzerland, but that stay in the north, nevertheless, had a major impact on his political views and on the role he envisioned for himself. Vologda was not such a dismal provincial hole as you might think. There were quite a few exiled revolutionaries there, and not the most insignificant ones. Stalin did time in Vologda, the house can still be visited, as did Anatoly Lunacharsky, the first Bolshevik People's Commissar of Culture. Discussing politics with countless like-minded people, but also with ideological opponents, Savinkov eventually decided to join the socialist-revolutionaries. Like the Bolsheviks, the socialist-revolutionaries also dreamed of a socialist utopia, but they believed that Russia, an enormous country without any industry to speak of, should not bet on the urban proletariat, which was still small and underdeveloped. It was the impoverished peasantry that should become the driving force behind the revolution. As an official reason for his choice, Savinkov later stated that Lenin and his Bolsheviks had ignored the agrarian question. Whether this was so important to Savinkov personally is doubtful. Savinkov was a romantic and a man of action. He had little interest in theoretical questions, and his love for or acquaintance with the Russian peasant must have been rather limited. He was, after all, a well-educated city boy. The main reason why he was attracted to the socialist revolutionaries was that this group firmly believed in terror as an effective method of disrupting the existing order. The socialist revolutionaries considered themselves the heirs of the Narodniki, the populists, in particular of the People's Will, the terrorist organization that had assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Savinkov was clearly impressed by their struggle and was determined to follow in their footsteps. Eventually he was recruited by Ekaterina Breshko-Breshkovskaya, the grandmother of the Russian Revolution, who had been a radical populist for years. She also helped Savinkov escape to Switzerland. There he was introduced to Evno Aziev, the acting head of the combat organization of the socialist revolutionaries. The combat organization was responsible for carrying out terrorist attacks. From Aziev, who would later be exposed as a double agent, Savinkov received his first major assignment: to coordinate the assassination of Minister of Interior von Plehve. After stalking their intended victim for weeks, and after several failed attempts, Savinkov and 4 other combatants, including Kalyaev and Dora Brilliant, finally succeeded in carrying out the plan. On July 15, 1904, Yegor Sazonov, dressed as a railway worker, threw a bomb at von Plehve's carriage. The minister and his coachman were killed. It was a resounding success for the socialist-revolutionaries. Terrorism. Our understanding of it has been shaped by 9/11 and the attacks by Islamic State. But in late Imperial Russia, the legitimate goals of political violence were defined more narrowly. Targets were members of the imperial family, government officials, and traitors, informants who tried to thwart terrorist operations. In general, they tried to spare soft targets, defenseless civilians, although it was nearly impossible to avoid innocent bystanders getting killed. In the attack on von Plehve, his coachman didn't survive. In addition, some splinter groups resorted to more indiscriminate forms of violence, including using increasingly heavy explosives. In 1906, a group of maximalists, socialist-revolutionaries who no longer wanted to submit to the party's central committee, attempted to assassinate the country's prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin. The attempt failed, but 27 people were killed and more than 60 injured. Naturally, the increasingly brutal violence didn't do the reputation of the socialist revolutionaries any good. But in 1903-1904, when Savinkov and Kalyaev had just joined the combat organization of the socialist revolutionaries, terrorists were widely seen as martyrs, heroes who sacrificed their young lives in exchange for that of a governor or a minister. The idea was that the terrorist himself would also get killed, or if he survived the attack, that he was arrested and sentenced to death. In this way, he served the revolution and atoned for the blood he had shed. It's a thoroughly romantic idea that conveniently ignored the risk of causing collateral damage. What's more, some terrorists survived the attack and managed to escape. Nevertheless, the idea of heroic self-sacrifice played an important role in the mythology of the revolutionary movement. It was even an obsession for some of Savinkov's accomplices. It was often disputed who was allowed to throw the first bomb. The following excerpt is from The Pale Horse. It's a conversation between the three designated bombers and George, the leader of the group. George is also the narrator of the story, in whom we can easily recognize Savinkov himself.
On the 14th, the Governor-General is going to the theatre. We need to agree on our posts. Who will throw the first bomb? Heinrich becomes agitated. I want to be first. Vanya has light brown hair, grey eyes, and a pale forehead. I regard him questioningly. Heinrich repeats, I insist on being first. I insist. Vanya smiles affectionately. No, Heinrich. I've been waiting a long time. Don't be angry. It's my turn. I want to be first. Fyodor puffs his cigarette indifferently. I ask, Fyodor, what do you think? Well, I'm always ready. Then I say, the Governor-General will probably go through Spassky Gate. Vanya will be at Spassky, Fyodor at the Trinity, and Heinrich at Borovichi. Vanya will throw the first bomb. Everyone remains silent.
These are, of course, only fictional characters, but it's certain that Savinkov's accomplices were obsessed with the terror and also realized the enormous moral debt they were taking on. Strange as it may sound, Ivan Kalyaev was a devout Christian, yet he was convinced of the necessity to kill Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich. That was what the revolution demanded, and he gave his life for it. Savinkov himself must have been less pathological in this regard. Richard Spence, who's written a lengthy biography of Savinkov, puts it this way, with a sense of understatement.
Like his comrades Sazonov, Brilliant, and Kalyaev, Savinkov was willing to kill for the cause. But unlike them, he was not particularly interested in dying for it.
Spence even called Savinkov a voyeur, which might suggest that Savinkov shied away from the action itself. But here we must realize that he had a different role, and that no one ever questioned his courage, or his willingness to use the weapons he always carried with him. The idea of voyeurism mainly relates to Savinkov's sense of the theatrical, his ability to perceive a murder plot aesthetically, that is, as something that requires creativity, planning, deception, disguise, and role-play. In this respect, Savinkov was different from his comrades for whom terrorism was a necessity and a moral dilemma. Savinkov was in many ways an outsider among the socialist revolutionaries, and not particularly willing to subject himself to party discipline. He was cold-blooded and devoted to the revolution, so you could trust him to organize an assassination plot, but he tended to deviate from the party line and do as he pleased. This is best illustrated by the theoretical underpinnings that the socialist revolutionaries gave for terrorism. Terrorist attacks were justified on the grounds that they served at least two goals. They would intimidate and confuse the authorities, and thereby destabilize the entire regime, and attacks on top officials would generate publicity, which would help mobilize the masses. On this point, the socialist revolutionaries differed fundamentally from Lenin's Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks believed in a violent seizure of power, but not in the methods of attacks directed against individual representatives of the old regime. But the theory of the socialist revolutionaries also dictated that violence could only be effective if the bond with the people remained intact. The terrorists had to realize that they were part of a mass movement. Isolation from the masses and elitist detachment were to be always avoided. To prevent the violence from spiraling out of control, it was imperative that the combat organization, the party's terrorist unit, was directly accountable to the Central Committee. The Central Committee was the ultimate arbiter that could initiate or stop terrorist activities. Most of these theories came from Viktor Chernov, one of the founders of the Partia socialist-revolutionaries, the PSR. He was arguably Savinkov's fiercest opponent in the party. His ideas were published in the party newspaper Revolutionary Russia in 1902, the year the PSR was formally founded. 3 years later, however, that's in 1905 when the Grand Duke was killed, things had thoroughly changed. The idea of a terrorist unit that submits completely to the Central Committee and yet remains connected to the people now seemed like pure fiction. Contrary to how Chernov had envisioned it, in Savinkov's words, the combat organization had become
a separate and independent entity, subject only to its own laws.
Savinkov was not simply bragging. By 1905, the combat organization functioned de facto as an autonomous unit with a strong group consciousness. It even had its own well-stocked coffers that allowed Savinkov to disguise himself as a wealthy British businessman in the run-up to the Van Pleve assassination. He went on a shopping spree and bought jewelry for Dora Brilliant, who was posing as his mistress. In short, Savinkov had no qualms about behaving in a manner that suggested he was completely dissociating himself from the Central Committee and the masses. Although he also had a number of less spectacular disguises, such as that of a street vendor, it's significant that his repertoire included several foreigners, identities that were far removed from the peasantry whose interest the socialist revolutionaries claimed to serve. All in all, Savinkov developed more and more into a barin, a gentleman, with which he moved further and further away from the ideal image of the terrorist as Chernov had once envisioned.
This is Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature. Your host is Otto Boele.
The assassination of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich in 1905 was the pinnacle of the combat organization's existence and of Savinkov's personal career as a terrorist. Just weeks later, the organization was severely weakened by a spate of arrests. By the end of the year, the Central Committee decided to dissolve the combat organization, despite Savinkov's protest. While the terror would eventually be resumed, none of those attacks would be as spectacular as the earlier killings. The old method of stalking and covert observation had become obsolete, especially because security measures were tightened. Attempts against lower officials were more successful, but they were mostly carried out in the provinces by smaller terrorist units or even individuals operating on their own. These almost indiscriminate attacks on anyone associated with the regime quickly discredited the PSR and the revolutionary movement as a whole. Savinkov's own role in the PSR was not yet fully played out. Until Azev's exposure as a police informant in December 1908, he made several plans for attacks, one even more spectacular than the other. One of these plans involved using an airplane to bomb Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's main residence. And he wanted to sink the emperor's yacht with a submarine. All of this came to nothing, however, not even after Savinkov himself was appointed head of the combat organization in 1909. Various explanations have been offered for this lack of success, ranging from Savinkov's morphine addiction to possible doubts about the effectiveness of terrorism and a general tendency to live it up at the party's expense. It's also quite possible that Savinkov simply had too many enemies within the party to be successful. Gradually, Savinkov the terrorist gave way to Savinkov the writer, and in that capacity people got to know him better and better, both in Russia and abroad.
He's run off. He has escaped the clutches of the authorities. He has escaped the locks, the bolts, all violence and arbitrariness. He has escaped the noose, possible execution. Blessed be the name of those who helped him to do this. A feeling of elusive happiness fills my chest. He's saved. I can fall asleep without that horrifying, intrusive thought of his execution. After a long, long time of persistent sadness, a ray of happiness finally enters my life. What if they catch him again? Once again a sense of dread overwhelms me. Only after a few days did I receive a postcard from abroad with his familiar greeting. Hello. Immediately an impossibly heavy burden slipped of my soul, and I sank into the deep sleep of real, intense rest.
These exalted words are taken from Years of Sorrow, Memories of a Mother, written by Savinkov's mother, Sofia Savinkova. She describes the relief she felt when she was told in 1906 that her son had fled abroad. Savinkov had been arrested in Sevastopol in Crimea, actually more or less by chance. He was immediately imprisoned, visited by his mother, who appealed to all her connections to ease her son's fate. That seemed to go nowhere, so she feared the darkest scenario. But Savinkov managed to escape from prison, disguised as a soldier, and reach Romania via the Black Sea. Eventually he ended up in France, still brooding on all kinds of terrorist plans. But in Paris he made many new acquaintances, both in political and literary circles. He befriended two writers in particular, the poet Zinaida Ghipius and her husband Dmitry Merezhkovsky, a literary critic and author of historical novels. Ghipius and Merezhkovsky are not well known in the West, but they are two resounding names from turn-of-the-century Russian literature. You could compare them with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, an inseparable intellectual tandem. Under the mentorship of these two writers, but especially Ghipius, Savinkov began work on The Pale Horse. Simultaneously, he was writing a more factual account of the murders of von Plehve and Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich that would be published under the title Memories of a Terrorist, a European bestseller. In this factual account, Savinkov explains why it was the terror that attracted him. We might be tempted to think that the term terrorist is a stigma for discrediting political opponents. We see that in Russia today. Ukrainian troops fighting to reclaim occupied territory are called terrorists too. But for Savinkov and his associates, the term was a badge of honor. It was proof that they were working in the absolute avant-garde of the revolution.
In Geneva, I met Mikhail Gotz. When he saw me, he said, "So you want to be active in the terror?" "Of course." "Just the terror?" "Yes." "And why don't you want to engage in the more general propaganda work?" I told him that I attached decisive importance to terror, but that I was completely at the disposal of the Central Committee and was ready to participate in any activity.
It may seem surprising that a terrorist suddenly made the switch to literature, and could also count on the support of established writers, but it had been done before. Some 20 years earlier, Sergei Kravchinsky had been quite successful with his novel The Career of a Nihilist, in which the author drew on his own experience as a terrorist while providing a kind of who is who of Russia's revolutionary movement. The novel was translated into several European languages, making Stepniak Kravchinsky a welcome guest in the literary circles of Western Europe. Savinkov was a fairly well-read man. At least he tried to convey that impression by fondly quoting Lermontov and Simeon Natsan, romantic and socially engaged poets. He had already published one story and had advised Leonid Andreev, a very popular writer at the time, who caused a sensation with the Story of the Seven Hanged, about a group of revolutionaries awaiting their execution. Now, in the relative safety of his Paris apartment, Savinkov finally had the chance to pursue his literary ambitions and write a proper novel. And so it happened. And here we finally come to the novel The Pale Horse. Written in the form of a diary, it tells the story of a terrorist leader who arrives in Moscow to instigate an assassination plot against the local governor. After assuming the identity of a British tourist named George O'Brien, the hero meets his accomplices and discusses the details of the assassination, but he does so with a mixture of cynicism and boredom. Unlike his four comrades, who believe in the ideals of the revolution and are ready to die for it, George feels nothing but indifference.
I had arranged to meet Vanya in a dirty pub. He arrived wearing high boots and a light coat. He now has a beard and his hair is cut in a straight line. He says, "Listen, have you ever thought about Christ?" "About whom?" I asked. "About Christ, the God-man, Christ. Have you ever asked what to believe and how to live? You know, when I'm home in the courtyard, I often read the gospel and it seems to me that there are two paths, only two. One way is everything is permissible. You see, everything. If you have the guts to do it, that is, if you can bring yourself to do it. After all, if God does not exist and Christ is a man, then there is no love, then there is nothing. The other way is the way of Christ. Listen, if you really love, you can kill, yes, right?" I say, "It's always possible to kill." "No, not always. No, to kill is a great sin. But remember, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his soul for his friends. Not one's life, but one's soul. Understand this, he must accept his own torment. He must resolve to do everything out of love, for the sake of love."
Vanya, who will finally throw the fatal bomb, is deeply religious. He knows that killing is wrong, and yet he's ready to take on this grave sin, to sacrifice his soul for the salvation of others. On the other hand, there is the narrator, George, who wants to avoid any moral discussion, not because his conscience torments him, but because he seems to have no conscience at all. Like Savinkov, George is the leader of the terrorist group, and therefore someone who coordinates everything, but doesn't throw a bomb himself. Yet at the end of the novel, when the attack has succeeded and the governor of Moscow is dead, George does kill in a private manner. He shoots the husband of his mistress. This all happens in a kind of duel-like setting. Both men have revolvers and both fire a shot. But when George emerges victorious, he feels no joy or relief. He realizes that he has killed someone, not for the revolution, but for his personal interest, while perhaps it could have been avoided. The inner emptiness that has been foreshadowed from the beginning now fully imposes itself on him. While we're not sure, it's a diary after all, the latest entries suggest that he will take his own life.
It's a clear and pensive day. The Neva is glittering in the sun. I love its majestic smoothness, the bed of its deep and still waters. The sad sunset dies in the sea. The purple skies are aflame. The waves splash sadly. The fir trees bend their tops. It smells of resin. When the stars come out, autumn night will fall, and I will say my last word. My revolver is with me.
Russian literature of the 19th century has no shortage of one-dimensional revolutionaries dedicated to the struggle against the autocracy. Remember Chernyshevsky's heroes that we encountered in the second episode of the series? Remember Bazarov, the charismatic hero of Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons. Even if they were not so unequivocal, they could be interpreted as such by radical critics. Savinkov's novel broke with this tradition. As in Artsibashev's novel Sanin, which we covered in the previous episode, the Pale Horse demystified the monolithic revolutionary hero. He's no longer the charismatic martyr of the revolution, but an opportunist without ideals, a cynic even. George kills for his own sake, and he expresses genuine doubts about the end, which, according to revolutionary logic, justifies the means. He bluntly states,
I don't believe in paradise on earth. I don't believe in paradise in heaven.
All in all, George seems to be increasingly questioning the rationale behind the terror, which dictates that it's terrible but necessary. To the socialist-revolutionaries, this was of course an affront. How could a comrade, one of their own ranks, so defile the sacred cause? Should we then understand the novel as the confession of a remorseful terrorist? Did Savinkov really change his mind? Most critics saw it that way, especially when it turned out that Savinkov was behind the pseudonym V. Ropshin. According to conservative and liberal opinion makers, the novel represented the moral bankruptcy of the revolutionary movement, which succumbed to its own extremism. All things considered, The Pale Horse could be interpreted as a hopeful indication that the radical left was sobering up and becoming more receptive to ideas from outside its own circle. How else could you explain the main character's suicide? The idea that The Pale Horse could, and perhaps should be read as an authentic confession was most emphatically put forth by Merezhkovsky, who had closely followed the writing of the novel and of course knew that Savinkov was the real author. In an extensive review, he praised the novel as the most Russian book since the immortal works of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, not so much because of the book itself, but because of what lies behind it. Here, Merezhkovsky was probably thinking not only of Savinkov's very real experience with terrorism, but also of the long discussions he and his wife Gippius had had with Savinkov about the moral justification of violence. Zinaida Gippius recalls the following.
Savinkov's problem was mainly that while committing such a murder, he had the feeling that he himself was being killed. He said that the blood of the victims weighed heavily on him. And approaching Merezhkovsky was half because he hoped that he would justify revolutionary terror, and half because he wanted to hear a final verdict about it, and a verdict about himself. There was no escaping the question of whether violence was permitted. We were also in favour of the revolution. Weren't we against the autocracy? It was all too easy to say no to violence.
Gippius' memoirs suggest that Savinkov really struggled with the question of violence. But perhaps we shouldn't be too quick to conclude that it was remorse, or only remorse, that inspired him to write The Pale Horse. He never ceased to use violence and terror, not only against Tsarist officials, but also after 1917 against the Bolsheviks. Moreover, in the same year that his novel was published, he became head of the combat organization that he would lead for more than 2 years. The American historian Lynn Allen Patik therefore doubts whether the novel should be read as a moral critique of terrorism. She points out that Savinkov had always written stories, symbolist poetry, novels, and so The Pale Horse can best be seen as the first literary part of his self-mythologization. Savinkov was a great admirer of romantic poets such as Byron and Lermontov, which must have made him receptive to the idea that he could shape his own life as a work of art, in which his tormented consciousness occupied a central place. The autobiographical elements in The Pale Horse seem obvious, but we must recognize that the characters, and the central hero in particular, are imbued with literarity. In the novel we find a Byronic Lermontovian hero, a tormented personality that Gippius and Merezhkovsky recognized in Savinkov himself. Savinkov published a second novel called What Never Happened in 1912, 3 years after his debut. It's a much thicker and more traditional novel that tells the story of 3 brothers who all die in the name of the revolution. The novel contains much more violence than The Pale Horse, and thus evokes a striking picture of the anarchy and chaos roughly in the years 1904-1908. It's not the individual terrorists, but the organizations behind them that come off badly. Party members brag about the revolution, but have lost all sense of reality. The entire resistance movement is in fact a shambles. As might be expected, What Never Happened caused an even bigger scandal in the ranks of the socialist-revolutionaries than The Pale Horse. Savinkov was now widely regarded as an unscrupulous traitor, but apart from defaming his former comrades and discrediting the revolutionary movement as a whole, the novel also seemed to articulate a militant chauvinism more likely to come from a conservative right-wing author. Thus the deepest emotion that drives the eldest of the 3 fictional brothers to support the revolution is outrage at Russia's humiliating defeat against Japan in the years 1904-1905. Wandering through the Kremlin, he experiences an epiphany of his Russian soul.
Only here in peasant Moscow, in the city of tar, cloth, miracle-performing icons, did he feel with all his heart that he was Russian, that his blood connected him with Russia.
These are just the words of a fictional character, but they might be indicative of Savinkov's own inner change. At the eve of the First World War, he seemed more concerned with Russia as a nation than with the revolution. When the Great War started, Savinkov did something few left-wing radicals would do. He welcomed the war and called for the suspension of all revolutionary activities. Everyone had to rally behind the nation. The motherland was calling. For some time, Savinkov worked as a freelance war correspondent in France and Belgium and showed himself to be an unadulterated patriot, a supporter of the Allied cause. He returned to Moscow in April 1917, a month after Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. Savinkov went to the front as a military commissar to boost the morale of the soldiers and to urge them not to give in to the anti-war propaganda of the Bolsheviks. For 2 months he was acting Minister of War in Kerensky's provisional government. But the provisional government didn't last long, and in October 1917 Lenin seized power. From that moment on, Savinkov had only one thing on his mind: to drive Lenin and his Bolsheviks out of Russia. He was so desperate to end Bolshevik power that he forged the most unlikely political alliances, both within war-torn Russia and abroad. But it all came to nothing. The fact that he approached Alexander Kolchak, commander-in-chief of the White Army, and openly admired him, or even tried to win over Benito Mussolini to his cause, testifies to the desperation he must have felt and to his fascination with strong leaders. According to his biographers, he was more interested in power than in the revolution. He was more an authoritarian than a democrat. But that, of course, applies to more revolutionaries. In the end, Savinkov decided to return to Soviet Russia, knowing all too well that he would be arrested and convicted for his counter-revolutionary activities. Like other emigrants, he may have hoped to join the Bolsheviks, believing that his experience could still be of use. It is indeed remarkable that during his imprisonment and interrogation by Felix Dzerzhinsky, the notorious head of the Secret Service, the Cheka, Savinkov was allowed to continue writing and that his stories were even published. One of these stories, titled Captured, is about a counter-revolutionary whose self-aggrandizement and cowardice are contrasted with the correctness and honesty of the Cheka officers who interrogate him. Savinkov died in captivity on May 7, 1925. When he was taken back to his cell after an interrogation, he seized the opportunity and jumped out of an open window on the 5th floor of the Lubyanka prison. This, at least, is the official version, but rumors that Savinkov was pushed spread almost immediately when his death was announced. There is a third, highly improbable version, which has never been debunked. According to this version, the suicide attempt was fake. It was staged by the Cheka, or by Savinkov himself. He supposedly managed to escape and lived well after 1925. As I said, it's a very unlikely story, but the rumor alone is like a monument to Savinkov's talent for deception and disguise.
Thank you, Otto. The next episode is about A Ticket to the Stars by Vasily Aksionov.
Yes, we're entering the Soviet period, the so-called thaw to be precise. After Stalin's death in 1953, young writers tried to revitalize Russian literature, and they were given ample opportunity to do so under the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev. And just to give you an idea what the novel is like, the novel that will feature in the next episode, Ticket to the Stars by Vasily Aksionov, it was generally considered the Soviet equivalent of The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Both innovative and tremendously popular novels about rebellious young people.
Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature is a podcast by Otto Boele and Kai Mastenbroek, produced by Electrical Films. Voice actors are Maruska Hamer and Domenico Gemoli. This series was made with contributions from the Anna Quassev from the Cup Fund and the Leiden University Center for the Arts and Society. The names of the translators and other important references can be found in the description of this podcast. The series is copyrighted by Otto Boele and Electrical Films.